My name is Ibrahim Traoré. I am the president of Burkina Faso. I come from a land that many in the world only notice when there is tragedy. A land spoken of in statistics, in reports, in security briefings. Burkina Faso is often described through what it lacks, not through what it carries. Yet, like much of Africa, it carries memory, dignity, fatigue, and hope, all at the same time. Our continent has lived through promises that arrived loudly and left quietly. We have known aid that did not heal, partnerships that did not respect, and leadership that sometimes forgot the people while speaking in their name. Africa is not poor in spirit, but it is tired of being managed instead of being trusted. I say this not as an accusation, but as a confession, because I too live inside this tension. I am not a man who spends his nights searching for visions. I am not someone who claims easy access to the supernatural. Most days my faith is quiet. It exists more in responsibility than in ritual, more in burden than in certainty. That night was not special. There was no ceremony, no prayer for revelation. I had finished my work late. The kind of work that leaves the body exhausted and the mind still restless. I remember sitting alone reviewing documents that spoke of security, resources, and numbers that represented real human lives. At some point, without intention, I closed my eyes. I did not drift gently into sleep. It felt as though I stepped into it. What followed was not a dream that faded with the morning. It did not dissolve into symbolism or confusion. It stayed with a clarity that unsettled me, not because it was dramatic, but because it was familiar, too familiar. I saw Africa, but not as a map, not as a speech. I saw it as a consequence. And in that space, where nothing looked unreal yet nothing obeyed ordinary rules, I was not alone. The place did not feel like heaven, and it did not feel like earth. It had no sky I could point to, no ground I could name. Yet everything felt solid, honest, as if nothing there needed to pretend. There were no colors demanding attention, no fire, no light overwhelming the senses. Just a stillness that was not empty, but listening. I became aware of a presence before I saw a figure. Not fear, not comfort either, something closer to recognition. The way you recognize truth before you understand it. When I looked up, he was there. Jesus did not appear as art had trained me to expect. There was no halo, no dramatic glow, no voice that echoed. He stood as one stands when there is nothing to prove. His face carried neither anger nor softness. It carried weight. The weight of someone who has seen everything and still chooses to speak. He did not accuse me. He did not praise me. He did not call me righteous or corrupt. He simply looked at me as if I were fully visible. I did not come to frighten you, he said. His voice was calm, almost ordinary. I came because you are tired of lies, even the ones you tell yourself. I wanted to respond with explanations, with context, with the language of leadership, but none of that rose to the surface. Words felt unnecessary, almost dishonest. He did not ask about my faith. He did not ask about my politics. He did not ask about my enemies. Instead, he said something that unsettled me more than any warning. You already know what is coming, he said. But knowing is not the same as choosing. Around us, the stillness shifted, not violently, slowly, like a curtain being drawn back without sound. I understood then that what I was about to see was not punishment, it was consequence. And that frightened me more than judgment ever could. The scene changed without warning, not like a dream that jumps, but like memory returning. I saw cities rising across Africa, towers of glass, roads wide and smooth, lights that stayed on through the night. From a distance, it looked like success. The kind that appears in international reports and investment brochures. But as I moved closer, something felt wrong. People walked through these cities as strangers in their own land. Homes stood tall, yet families were absent from them. Buildings were owned, but not lived in. Growth had happened, but belonging had not followed. Jesus did not gesture, he did not explain, he simply allowed me to see. I watched men and women pass through gates guarded not by soldiers, but by contracts. Legal language replaced human recognition. A person could be born in a place and still be told they did not qualify to live there. These cities were built, I said almost defensively, to attract development. Jesus answered without raising his voice. Development for whom? I saw workers who constructed these buildings returning each evening to settlements without water, without security, without dignity. They had raised walls they would never enter. Their labor had value. Their lives did not. The logic behind it all sounded reasonable. I could hear it clearly. We must grow first, the voices said. Inclusion can come later. Sacrifice is necessary. This is realism. I felt the pull of that argument. I had used versions of it myself. not because it was cruel, but because it sounded practical, because it allowed delay without calling it betrayal. Jesus turned to me then. When people are asked to wait too long for dignity, he said, they do not lose patience, they lose themselves. I saw children learning early that silence was safer than truth, that survival required adaptation, not justice. Schools taught obedience more efficiently than honesty. Questions were discouraged, not by force, but by consequence. This is how inequality becomes culture, Jesus said, not through hatred, but through normalization. I wanted to argue that this was not unique to Africa, that the world worked this way everywhere, that perfection was impossible. He looked at me again, not with disagreement, but with clarity. Poverty can be survived, he said, but the quiet acceptance of exclusion cannot. The cities remained standing as the vision faded, beautiful, functional, empty of meaning. I understood then that collapse does not always arrive with noise, sometimes it arrives with applause. The ground beneath the city began to open, not violently but methodically. Layers of earth were peeled back with efficiency, machines moved with confidence. Charts appeared in the air filled with projections, timelines, and promised returns. I recognized this language. I had spoken it. I had signed documents written in it. Gold, lithium, manganese, oil. Names spoken with reverence, as if they were virtues rather than substances. I watched as resources were extracted faster than conversations could keep up with them, faster than laws could protect them, faster than the people beneath the soil could understand what was being taken. This is development, I said quietly, more to myself than to him. Jesus did not contradict me. He waited. I saw contracts being signed in rooms far from the land they described. Hands shook, smiles appeared, words like partnership and opportunity floated freely. There was no shouting, no obvious theft. Everything looked respectable. But then I saw the delay. Communities waited for schools that never arrived, hospitals that remained announcements, clean water that stayed in presentations. Each delay was justified. Each excuse sounded reasonable on its own. Implementation takes time, the voices said. Stability first, infrastructure later. Trust the process. I felt a familiar tightening in my chest. Because this was not a lie shouted loudly. It was a truth postponed endlessly. Jesus finally spoke. When truth moves slower than extraction, he said, it is not delayed, it is denied. I saw local leaders pressured into silence, not with threats, but with incentives. A seat at the table, a promise of future relevance. The language used was careful, almost kind. This is compromise, they were told. You must be pragmatic. Ideals do not feed people. I watched a man sign away land he would never walk on again. His face did not show guilt. It showed relief. Relief from conflict. Relief from resistance. Relief from being called difficult. This is how corruption survives, Jesus said, not by presenting itself as evil, but by presenting itself as necessary. I wanted to protest. I wanted to say that refusing such deals could mean sanctions, isolation, instability. That leadership often meant choosing the least damaging option. Jesus turned toward me fully now. Power always claims it has no choice, he said. That is how it avoids responsibility. The most painful part came next. I saw Africans negotiating against Africans, using the same language once imposed from outside, measuring their own people with metrics that ignored humanity, explaining loss as inevitability. The oppressor no longer needs to arrive, Jesus said. He has already been trained. That sentence stayed with me longer than any image. I felt exposed, not accused, exposed. As if my justifications were being laid out gently, but without permission to hide. I understood then that the greatest theft was not of minerals, but of moral clarity. When extraction becomes faster than truth, conscience becomes an inconvenience. The ground closed again, the machines continued, the paperwork remained flawless, and I was left standing with a question I could not escape. If everything is legal but nothing is honest, what exactly have we built? The scene shifted again, quietly, almost mercifully. I found myself standing inside a classroom, not broken, not chaotic, clean floors, straight desks, a blackboard filled with careful handwriting. From the outside, it looked like progress, like success. Children sat in rows, their backs straight, their eyes forward. They were not afraid. That was what unsettled me most. They were calm, too calm. A teacher asked a question, not a dangerous one, not political, just a question that invited thought. I watched a boy raise his hand halfway, then slowly lower it. His eyes shifted, not toward the teacher, but toward his classmates. Toward the room, no one spoke. Jesus stood beside me. He said nothing at first. I listened closely, and I realized the silence was learned. It was practiced. These children were not refusing to think. They were refusing to risk. They are disciplined, I said, trying to hold on to something positive. Yes, Jesus replied, but not educated. I watched lessons continue. Facts were repeated. Answers were memorized. History was simplified until it no longer disturbed anyone. Questions were treated as distractions, not as signs of intelligence. A girl finally spoke. She asked why a village near her home no longer had water, even though a project had been announced. The room shifted, not in anger, in discomfort. The teacher paused, smiled gently, then redirected the lesson. That topic is not for today, he said. I saw the moment land inside the child, not as punishment, but as instruction. She learned something more important than the curriculum. She learned when not to speak. This is how injustice survives generations, Jesus said, not because children are taught to lie, but because they are taught to avoid truth. The argument supporting this system was familiar. It always is. We must maintain stability, the voices said. Critical thinking can come later. Right now we need unity. Obedience creates order. I felt the weight of that logic. In regions shaped by conflict, silence can look like peace. Questioning can look like danger. But then Jesus said something that cut through my reasoning. Order without conscience is only quiet violence, he said. The classroom dissolved, and I saw those children years later. As officials, as managers, as leaders, efficient, calm, careful. They did not steal loudly. They did not abuse power recklessly. They followed procedures. They enforced rules. They managed decline. They are not cruel, I said, almost pleading. No, Jesus answered, they are trained. I understood then that the loss of a continent does not begin with guns. It begins when children are taught that asking why is more dangerous than accepting wrong. When silence becomes intelligence, collapse becomes polite. The image faded slowly, as if to give me time to feel its weight. I needed that time. The classroom dissolved into corridors, long ones, clean ones, air-conditioned. I recognized them immediately. Government buildings, ministries, offices where the language of authority lives. Everything functioned, files moved, meetings started on time, reports were written carefully, nothing appeared broken. And yet, nothing felt alive. I watched leaders speak fluently about policy while avoiding responsibility. Their words were precise, their intentions were never stated. Each decision passed through layers of committees, advisors, and protocols until no single person could be named as the source. This is governance, I said. This is order. Jesus walked beside me slowly, as if giving the scene time to indict itself. This is management, he said, not leadership. I saw laws displayed proudly. Constitutions framed on walls, charters translated into multiple languages. Everything existed on paper. Everything looked impressive. But outside those walls, nothing obeyed those laws. Justice was available but not accessible. Rights were declared but not protected. Courts existed but outcomes were negotiated elsewhere. The explanation sounded reasonable. It always does. Our institutions are young, the voices said. We must be patient. Reform takes time. I felt the temptation of that argument. I had used it. I had believed it. Because patience can be wisdom. But Jesus stopped walking. Patience becomes complicity, he said, when injustice is predictable. I saw leaders holding office not to serve but to survive. Their greatest skill was not vision but balance. They learned how not to offend the powerful, how not to disturb the system, how not to fall. They called it realism. This is how experience looks, one voice said. Idealism is for the young. I saw promises repeated across decades, the same words, the same slogans, new faces delivering old delays. Citizens stopped expecting change. They adjusted expectations downward until disappointment felt normal. This is stability, someone said. Jesus shook his head. This is exhaustion, he replied. Then came the most painful part. I saw myself reflected in them, not as a villain, not as a tyrant, but as a man tempted daily to accept partial truth for temporary peace, to choose what is survivable over what is right. I felt the weight of it settle into my chest. Is this inevitable? I asked. Is this simply how power works? Jesus looked at me with something I can only describe as sorrow, not for me alone, but for every leader who has asked that question. Power does not corrupt first, he said. It persuades. He showed me the moment it begins. Not with cruelty, with justification. Just this once. Just until stability returns. Just until the economy improves. Just until the next election. just until the pressure eases. Each compromise sounded small. Each delay felt strategic. But when truth is postponed every day, Jesus said, it does not survive the calendar. I saw a nation slowly forget why its institutions existed. Law became procedure. Leadership became position. Responsibility became optional. And the people adapted. They no longer demanded integrity. They demanded predictability. That, I understood, was the real collapse. Not chaos, but acceptance. The corridor stretched on endlessly as the vision faded, efficient, calm, hollow. I stood in the silence that followed, knowing this was not a warning for Africa alone. It was a mirror. The corridors narrowed and opened into a chamber that felt older than the buildings before it. There were no flags, no microphones, just a table surrounded by men and women whose faces I recognized, not as individuals but as types. Negotiators, elders, advisors, survivors of many political seasons. They spoke softly, carefully. Every sentence was balanced, weighed, refined. No one raised their voice. No one threatened anyone else. And yet, something sacred was being surrendered. I listened. They spoke of realities on the ground, of geopolitical limits, of what can realistically be achieved. Each phrase carried the comfort of maturity, the kind that comes from having seen ideals fail. This is not betrayal, one of them said. This is compromise. Heads nodded. This is wisdom, another added. We must be flexible. I felt the pull of it immediately. Because rigidity can destroy a nation. Because stubbornness can cost lives. Because history punishes leaders who refuse to bend. I turned to Jesus. Is compromise always wrong? I asked. He did not answer immediately. He let the room speak. I watched as land was conceded without the people being consulted, as futures were delayed without dates attached, as principles were softened until they no longer resisted anything. Each decision was defended. We are avoiding conflict. We are buying time. We are protecting what little we have. None of it sounded evil. Then Jesus spoke. Compromise is not betrayal, he said, until it costs you your conscience. I saw how betrayal learned to wear a gentle face. It stopped announcing itself as treason. It called itself pragmatism. It dressed itself in responsibility. It learned to quote history. This is how tyrants are born, Jesus continued, not from hatred, from accommodation. That sentence unsettled me deeply. I had always imagined tyrants as men without morals, without restraint, monsters. But what I saw were men who had once wanted to do good. Men who had been tired, pressured, cornered. They had not chosen evil. They had chosen relief. Each time they surrendered a principle, they told themselves it was temporary. Each time they stayed silent, they told themselves it was strategic. Over time, the silence became habit. The habit became identity. I saw the transformation clearly. The moment a leader stops being disturbed by injustice, not because it ended, but because it became familiar. That is the moment collapse begins, Jesus said. I felt fear then, not for Africa alone, for myself. Because I understood how reasonable the path was, how easy it would be to walk it without noticing when I crossed the line. The room faded, leaving behind only the echo of rational voices explaining why conscience could wait. And I knew it could not. What came next was harder to watch. There was no foreign presence in this scene, no external flags, no outside commands. The language was familiar, the faces were familiar, the power was familiar. African leaders speaking to African people, African institutions enforcing African policies. African security forces standing between African citizens and their own dignity. At first it looked like sovereignty, independence, control. Then I noticed the tone. Orders were issued without explanation. Compliance was demanded, not earned. The justification was always the same. This is for your own good. I saw protests disperse quickly, not with cruelty but with efficiency, the kind that avoids headlines, the kind that claims professionalism. Citizens were not beaten, they were redirected, delayed, processed. Why are they angry? One official asked. Everything is legal. Jesus stood beside me, silent, letting the scene answer. I watched as laws were applied selectively, not to punish enemies but to protect allies, not to correct injustice, but to maintain order. And the most painful part was this. The enforcers believed they were right. They had been taught that conscience was weakness, that empathy was a liability, that authority must never hesitate. This is how oppression evolves, Jesus said. It stops needing an external master. I saw young officers trained to see citizens as variables, risks, data points. They were told this was professionalism, that emotional distance was maturity. They are doing their jobs, I said quietly. Yes, Jesus replied, but they have forgotten who they serve. I realized then that colonialism does not end when foreign control leaves. It ends when the logic of domination is rejected. Here, it had been inherited. I felt a deep discomfort settle in me, because this was not a story of villains. It was a story of systems, of people doing what they were trained to do, without ever being trained to question why. This is the most dangerous stage, Jesus said, when oppression no longer feels like oppression. The scene dissolved, leaving behind a heavy truth. Africa could not be saved by removing outsiders alone. It would only be saved when it refused to become its own oppressor. The images stopped coming. There was no final catastrophe. No collapse shown in flames, no continent falling into darkness. What remained was something quieter and far more difficult to escape. Stillness returned. Jesus faced me again, not as a messenger now, but as a witness. A continent can survive poverty, he said. It can survive invasion. It can even survive failure. I waited. I needed to hear the rest. But it cannot survive inner betrayal. That phrase did not strike me as poetic. It struck me as precise. He showed me nothing new. Instead, he allowed me to feel something I had avoided. The moment when truth no longer hurts. I saw leaders hearing reports of injustice and feeling nothing. Citizens watching corruption and shrugging. Communities learning to adapt to lies instead of resisting them. When truth no longer wounds, Jesus said, collapse has already begun. I thought of how often we measure danger by noise, by protest, by crisis. But what I was being shown was silence. The silence of resignation. This is not failure, he said. This is surrender. I asked him then the question I had been holding back. Is it too late? He did not answer immediately. Then he said, the future is not decided by what is shown. It is decided by what is chosen. I felt the weight of that responsibility settle fully on me. Not as a president, as a man, because I understood something clearly in that moment. No reform, no alliance, no investment could save Africa if its conscience was negotiated away. And no enemy could destroy it faster than its own abandonment of truth. Jesus looked at me one final time before the space began to change again. What you have seen is not prophecy, he said. It is pattern. The stillness deepened. And within it, I was shown something else. Not a warning, but a choice. The space changed again, but this time it did not feel imposed. It felt invited. Jesus did not show me buildings or crowds. He showed me a desk, an ordinary desk, papers stacked unevenly, a pen resting where a decision had just been made or was about to be made. This is where nations are shaped, he said, not in speeches, in choices no one applauds. I understood immediately. This was not about ideology, it was about temptation. I saw a leader seated at that desk, not a villain, not a hero, a capable man, educated, aware of history, aware of pressure. He wanted to improve the economy, he wanted growth, he wanted stability, and he was offered help. The offer came politely, with respect, with assurances. It did not ask him to steal openly. It did not ask him to abandon his people. It asked something much smaller. Just sign this, the voice said. It will unlock investment. Jobs will follow. Yes, there are irregularities, but they are manageable. Every country does this at your stage. I felt the argument land inside me. Because it sounded responsible, because it spoke the language of urgency. The leader hesitated. He knew the deal was compromised, not illegal, not entirely honest either. This will feed families, he told himself. I can correct the system later. Jesus stood beside the desk. This is where power begins to decay, he said, not when it is abused, but when it is justified. I saw the signature placed on the page. Nothing dramatic happened. No lightning, no condemnation. The economy did improve. For a while, numbers rose. Praise followed. The leader was called pragmatic, mature, serious. But something invisible shifted. The next offer came faster, slightly worse, slightly easier to accept. You already crossed this line, the voice said gently. Do not pretend you are still pure, at least make the best of it. I watched the leader's posture change over time. He became cautious, then defensive, then skilled at explanation. Jesus spoke again. You cannot build a clean future with contaminated authority. I wanted to object. I wanted to say that Africa needed roads, hospitals, schools, that moral purity did not pave highways. Jesus turned to me. A single ethical decision, he said, outweighs 10 corrupt projects. That sentence stayed with me because it contradicted everything development language had taught me. I was shown another leader. This one refused. He rejected the deal, he lost funding, he was mocked, his people suffered delays, critics called him naive. I felt the discomfort of that choice. It was not heroic. It was lonely. He will not last, the voices said. His country will fall behind. But something else happened. His refusal established a boundary. Advisors adjusted, partners recalculated, expectations shifted. Slowly, a different kind of respect emerged. Quieter, less flattering, more durable. This is what it means to cleanse power, Jesus said. Not to be perfect, but to be unbuyable. I saw how rare that quality had become, and how transformative it was when present. Economic reform without moral reform, Jesus continued, only accelerates injustice. He showed me nations where growth masked decay, where wealth expanded while trust collapsed, where institutions functioned but legitimacy evaporated. Then he showed me something harder. He showed me myself. Moments where I had chosen speed over integrity. Moments where I had accepted ambiguity to avoid confrontation, not crimes, compromises. I felt no condemnation, only clarity. Power must be treated as responsibility, Jesus said, not as reward. I understood then that the first path forward for Africa did not begin with money. It began with refusal. The refusal to normalize corruption by calling it realism. The refusal to trade conscience for applause. The refusal to confuse urgency with permission. This path is costly, Jesus said, and it must be chosen every day. That was the hardest part. There was no final victory shown. No moment where the struggle ended. Only a daily decision. To sign or not sign. To speak or stay silent. To lead or to manage. The desk faded from view, but the weight of that choice did not. It stayed with me. What appeared next was not a mine, not a field, not a map of wealth. It was a line of people. They were not begging. They were waiting. Men, women, elders, children. Standing quietly under a sun that did not rush. Each of them carried something invisible but heavy. Expectation, fear, hope restrained by experience. Jesus did not speak at first. He let me feel the slowness of the moment. These people live above resources the world desires, he said finally. But no one has asked what they desire. I watched officials arrive, clipboards in hand, vehicles clean, the language polite, the process efficient. Announcements were made, projects explained, timelines outlined, everything sounded correct. Then the questions came. Will we be moved? Will our children still attend school? Who decides compensation? The answers were vague, not dishonest, incomplete. Details will follow. Trust the process. Experts have assessed this. I felt an old familiarity, the kind that comes when systems speak to people instead of listening to them. They are protecting national interests, I said. Resources are strategic. Jesus turned to me gently. Resources only have meaning, he said, when they serve people, not when people are reorganized around them. I saw what followed when dignity was postponed. Communities fractured, elders lost authority, youth lost direction, families were relocated not violently but efficiently, paperwork replaced consent. They agreed, someone said. But I saw the agreement. It was signed under pressure, under uncertainty, under the quiet threat of being left behind. This is still development, I insisted, though my voice lacked conviction. Yes, Jesus said, but it is development that consumes trust. Then he showed me another place. In this one, leaders paused projects, not because they were unprofitable, but because communities were unprepared, because questions remained unanswered. Education came first, not obedience, but understanding. Children were taught how decisions are made, how laws work, how power should be questioned. They were encouraged to ask why. I felt discomfort rise in me. A questioning generation is unstable, I said. They challenge authority. Jesus nodded. Yes, he said. And they save nations from being sold quietly. I watched classrooms where truth was taught without fear, where history was not softened, where mistakes were named without humiliation. These children are slower to control, Jesus said, but harder to deceive. I understood the temptation to avoid this path. Education that teaches obedience is easier, faster, more predictable. Education that teaches truth is disruptive, demanding, uncomfortable. But I also saw the long arc, a generation that could not be easily bribed, a generation that recognized manipulation, a generation that refused to confuse loyalty with silence. Dignity is not a luxury, Jesus said, it is infrastructure. That sentence reshaped something in me. We speak often of roads, ports, and pipelines, but without dignity, those structures carry only extraction. I was shown nations that protected resources fiercely but neglected people. Their wealth grew, their cohesion did not. Their youth left, their elders mourned quietly. Then I was shown places where dignity was protected first. Growth came slower, but it lasted. Do not protect resources at the cost of human worth, Jesus said. Because resources can be replaced, a broken people cannot. I felt the weight of leadership again. The daily decisions, the pressure to deliver results quickly, the temptation to measure success in visible outputs. This path requires patience, he said, and courage, because it means explaining delays, facing criticism, allowing questions that have no immediate answers. It means choosing education over obedience, truth over convenience, people over projects. As the vision faded, I understood something deeply. Africa does not lack resources. It lacks leaders willing to protect dignity when it is inconvenient. The final path did not begin with institutions or resources, it began with distance. I was shown Africa from above, not as borders drawn by history, but as a living body, regions breathing differently, nations turning slightly away from one another, neighbors speaking the same pain in different languages. There were many partners surrounding the continent, many offers, many flags extended in friendship. Each alliance came with conditions spoken softly and consequences written small. We need partners, I said. We cannot stand alone. Jesus did not disagree. No nation survives alone, he said, but no nation survives divided within. I watched African leaders enter international rooms separately, each carrying their own urgencies, their own fears, their own timelines. They negotiated well, individually. They secured aid, individually. They defended sovereignty, individually. And each returned home, believing they had done what was necessary. But necessary for whom? Jesus asked. I saw how mistrust traveled faster than solidarity, how historical wounds between neighbors were kept alive because they served short-term leverage, how unity was discussed in speeches but avoided in practice. Unity is difficult, I said. Our histories are complicated. Yes, Jesus replied, but distrust has become convenient. I watched negotiations where African leaders undercut one another for advantage, offering better terms, lower standards, faster access. They called it competitiveness. This is realism, they said. Every nation must look after itself. Jesus spoke with firmness now. A continent that competes against itself, he said, will always be negotiated downward. I felt the truth of that immediately. I saw how external powers did not need to impose division, they only needed to wait. Fragmentation was already present, encouraged quietly, rewarded subtly. You do not lack partners, Jesus said. You lack trust in one another. That sentence struck me deeply, because I knew how often unity is spoken of as symbolism, not strategy, as ceremony, not discipline. He showed me another image. African leaders meeting not to impress outsiders, but to confront one another honestly. Naming fears, naming betrayals, naming past wounds without weaponizing them. It was not harmonious, it was tense. Voices were raised, truths were uncomfortable. This is inefficient, I said. Yes, Jesus answered, but it is real. From that discomfort emerged something fragile but powerful. Shared boundaries, shared standards, shared refusal to sell one another out quietly. Inner unity does not mean uniformity, Jesus said. It means conscience aligned. I saw what followed. External partnerships became balanced. Negotiations slowed. Demands were challenged. Exploitation became harder. Not because Africa became aggressive, but because it became coherent. When conscience is united, Jesus said, development is no longer imposed. I thought of how often Africa is described as dependent, as needing guidance, as lacking capacity. Yet what I saw was different. A continent not waiting for permission, not seeking approval, not measuring itself by external validation. A continent refusing to betray itself for short-term relief. This path is the hardest, Jesus said quietly, because it requires humility. Humility to admit past betrayals. Humility to rebuild trust slowly. Humility to say no, even when yes would be easier. As the vision began to fade, I realized something essential. Africa's greatest weakness is not poverty. It is fragmentation of conscience. and its greatest strength would not come from alliances signed abroad, but from loyalty restored at home. The images dissolved, the stillness returned, and then I woke. I did not wake with clarity, I woke with weight. Morning came as it always does, light through the window, the sounds of a country moving forward with or without revelation. The responsibilities remained, the decisions waited. Nothing in my office had changed. Everything inside me had. I am not sharing this because I believe dreams make leaders righteous, they do not. I am sharing it because leadership stripped of conscience becomes management of decline. I speak to Muslims, to Christians, to believers of every tradition, and to those who carry faith quietly or not at all. This is not a religious argument, it is a moral one. Africa will not be saved by stronger speeches, or louder nationalism, or more sophisticated partnerships. It will be shaped by ordinary decisions made daily by leaders who remember that power is borrowed, not owned. I do not present myself as a success. I do not claim purity. I fail, I hesitate, I feel fear. Every morning, I must choose again, whether to speak or remain silent, whether to resist or rationalize, whether to lead or to manage. And I know this now with painful clarity. A nation does not fall when it is attacked. It falls when it stops being disturbed by what is wrong. To those watching from afar, especially those who carry long memories of faith and leadership, I ask you to look beyond headlines, beyond simplifications, beyond the temptation to see Africa as a problem to be solved rather than a conscience to be respected. Pray for us if you pray. Question us if you believe in accountability, but do not give up on the idea that integrity still matters. Because when leaders abandon conscience, no policy can replace it. And when people abandon truth, no stability can save them. Every day I wake up and I must choose again. There is no final victory, only vigilance or surrender. If this reflection has stirred something in you, stay with the conversation. Listen, reflect, engage. The future is not shaped by those who rush past truth, but by those willing to sit with it. There is no final triumph, only the choice we make when no one is watching. I did not intend this reflection to end with certainty. Certainty is often where listening stops. If you have reached this point, it tells me something about you. You are not searching for spectacle, you are searching for meaning, and meaning is never finished in one telling. These words are not meant to convince you, they are meant to keep you awake. Awake to how easily good people excuse small wrongs. Awake to how often silence is mistaken for wisdom. Awake to the fact that history is shaped less by dramatic moments than by daily moral fatigue. I know many of you carry faith deeply, shaped by years, not trends. Some of you have followed leaders you admired, only to feel disappointment later. Others have learned to separate belief from power because power so often disappoints belief. I understand that instinct. I share it. That is why I speak not as a preacher, but as a man under responsibility, a man who knows that tomorrow will demand the same choices again, without applause, without certainty of success. If this reflection resonates, do not let it end here. Speak about it, write your thoughts, leave your disagreement if you have one. Truth sharpens when it is tested honestly, and if you wish to continue listening, quietly, without noise or slogans, stay connected. Not because I promise answers, but because the questions are worth keeping alive. Every day I wake up and must choose again. There is no final victory, only awareness or surrender. May we choose awareness today, and again tomorrow. There is nothing more to reveal after this. Not because the story is complete, but because the responsibility now shifts away from the narrator. What I shared was not meant to end with resolution. It was meant to end with awareness. The kind that stays with you after the voice fades. The kind that returns when decisions feel small but carry weight. If you expected a final sign, a promise, or a clean conclusion, I understand that expectation. We are trained to look for endings that reassure us. But real moral journeys do not end. They repeat. The dream did not give me certainty. It removed my excuses. And perhaps that is enough. If you are still here, still listening, then the reflection has already done its work, not by persuading you, but by slowing you down, by asking you to examine what you tolerate, what you justify, and what you quietly accept. That is where change begins. Not in agreement, but in honesty. Every day I wake up and must choose again. There is no final victory, only vigilance or surrender. Thank you for staying.